With every major release of Studio One, I try to do a getting started full course for beginners or anyone else who is switching from another DAW to Studio One to help you get acclimated and familiar with everything that is available in Studio One as far as the features, the tools, how you can go about recording audio, MIDI, and where you can find everything to get your ideas out and create your music. So with that in mind, I'm going to be going at a slower pace in this video, so if you're already familiar with Studio One, you've been using it for a year or two, this is not really going to be for you. This is for newcomers or people who are switching from another DAW just to help you get up and running. Now, if you'd like to speed up your learning curve or you're having any issues with Studio One, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced user, I do offer one-on-one training via Zoom. So you can check out the pinned comment below or the description area of this video for more information on that. Now, with all of that out of the way, we'll just go ahead and jump right into this. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is put Studio One into a full screen mode. So we'll get rid of that Windows taskbar at the bottom. So I'm going to hold Shift and press F as in Frank. Now we're in this full screen mode, which I like a lot better. Now, when we launch Studio One, we're taken to the start page, which we can see here, and we're just going to make our way across and cover some things that are important for you to know. Now, here we have a batch converter, which is now included with version 7, so you can process multiple audio files at one time with this feature here. We then have SoundCloud, and then we have our macro organizer. That's a bit more advanced. Now, you'll probably see a TuneCore, an icon for TuneCore. I have removed that from my Studio One application. But then let's move down. And so here we have a list of the recent files, the recent songs that we're working on. This is going to update dynamically. So when you create new songs, they'll be populated here. And this will just, again, dynamically update. You can, if you end up with a large list of songs here, we do have a search feature that we can make use of here. Now, if you would like to make sure that your songs are sticking around where you'd like, you can hover at the edge and then we'll get a pin icon here. So I'll go ahead and pin 3 of these. And then now we see we have pinned here with this disclosure arrow. And if I click on that, then we can see at the top immediately all 3 of the songs that we have pinned here. I'll go ahead and unpin these though. At any time that we'd like to remove these recent files from the list here, we can right click on it and no versions found for this. So we can just come to the bottom and remove from recent files list. Now again, if I right click, okay, none found. Let's try this one. Okay, we can also see auto-saved versions of the song. So if we end up with a big mess on our hands and we'd like to go back in time, we can choose from these auto-saved versions that are here. You can see the date and time there to help you find what you're looking for. We can open the song with options. We can show it in our Explorer or the Finder on the Mac. And as we already saw, we can remove from the recent files list. Now, next to our recent files, we have songs. So this, we're going to see everything that is within our song folder. So by default, if you're not changing the location where your songs are saved, that typically by default will go to your Documents folder on Windows, and then there will be a Studio One folder within there, and within the Studio One folder, there will be a song folder. So by default, all of your songs are being saved there, so they're going to be displayed in this area here. Now, if you have any projects, they're going to show up here. Again, this is going to be stored in your Documents folder in Studio One, then there will be a folder for projects. Shows, same deal. Okay, we'll come back to the recent files. Now, next we have artist profile, so you can create a profile for yourself. You can click once and enter a name in here. You can put in a genre. You can put in a website. You can click on this ellipsis here and add a picture if you'd like. And then here at the bottom right-hand corner, we can add multiple artists if you'd like. And all of this information is going to be included in our song file once we finish with it. Now here we have a SoundCloud tab, so we can connect a SoundCloud account if you have one, and you can upload directly to your SoundCloud account from Studio One. Over to the right, we have a news feed with information, news from Presonus and tutorials, but you should watch Quanta tutorials. Then we have our setup area at the bottom center. We can see the audio interface that we're using. If we click once, then we open up our audio setup tab within the options menu. We'll come back to that in just a moment. We can see our sample rate, our block size. We can configure audio device, which will take us back to the options menu, just as we saw with clicking on this. And we can configure external devices such as MIDI controllers. If we click on that, we're taken to the options menu and to the external devices tab. Okay, now at the bottom, we can check for updates, and then we can see the current version that we're using for Studio One here. Now in the top right corner, we can access our Presonus account and our profile with Presonus. Here, the home button, it's not active because we're on home, but these are going to show up no matter what page you're on, whether it's the show page, the song page, etc. These will always be here. Now this one is going to take you, if you have multiple songs open, you can switch between multiple songs by clicking here. Alternatively, if you have a song open and you come to the start page, you can get back to your song by clicking on this paper icon. Now we're working with an audio application, so we need a way to get audio into the application. So one of the most important things is setting up your audio interface. Now, as we've seen, we can click on this audio there, or we can click on configure audio device to access our audio setup. Now I'm using Windows Audio because for my screen capture program, I can't use my audio interface. It will not capture that audio. But whatever audio device you have, you can select it from this drop-down menu. So I have a Focusrite, so when I'm not recording tutorials, this is what I will use. Now, if you've purchased an audio interface and you're just getting started, please note that usually you'll have to download driver software and install that on your system in order for Studio One to recognize your audio interface. So if you've connected your audio interface and you're not seeing it, you may need to go to the manufacturer's website, download the driver for your audio interface, install it, and then it should populate within this window here. So again, you can select your audio interface by clicking on this drop-down menu. Now, when you install the driver software for your audio interface, once that's done, you can click on Control Panel, and that's going to take you to the proprietary software for that audio interface where you can make changes to the buffer size and things like that. This is just taking me to the Windows Audio because that's what I'm using. So this is my latency here, and I can adjust the latency for Windows here. Now the latency is basically just the time that it takes for, if you're recording a vocal, for instance, the time it takes for your vocal to go into your microphone, to the audio interface through the USB cable into your computer, into Studio One. If you have reverb on it, for instance, it will be processed, sent back out to the USB cable to your audio interface, and then into your headphones or speakers. So that's going to take some time. And the latency or the block size, so this is what this adjustment is on Windows. And we'll go ahead and close this out. But typically, you'll have an adjustment here where you can adjust the block size. So the lower that is, the less latency that you're going to have, but the more it's going to tax your processor. So just work on getting a good balance for that. You can experiment to find what's best for you. Now, if you're going to be using things like a media player, like VLC, or you're going to be watching YouTube videos, maybe some Quanta tutorials at the same time that you're using Studio One, you'll want to check this box to release your audio device so that your web browser or your media player like VLC can use your audio device. And then once you switch back to Studio One will grab your audio device back. Okay, so we'll click on OK here. And then what about a MIDI controller? Many of us may be using a MIDI controller, and with basic controllers, they're plug and play. You can just connect it. You don't need to install any software, but the more advanced controllers will have additional buttons and sliders, and sometimes you'll need to download software for that as well so that it will integrate with your DAW or Studio One in this instance. And we can configure our MIDI controllers by coming to Configure External Devices. So now we're on this External Devices in our Options menu, and then you can click on the Add button, and then to the left-hand side here we have a bunch of folders from different manufacturers. So a popular MIDI controller is from Akai, for instance, so the MPK Mini. So you can select this. We can see that this is populated in this top corner here. The device model, manufacturer, and all of that's filled in. The MIDI channels, you can select which MIDI channels you want to use. I typically will leave these all selected. Then you can come here and you should see your MIDI controller. In the drop-down menu, you can select it to receive that MIDI data from your controller into this device. And then if your MIDI controller has additional functionality like pads that will light up and change colors, then you can set the send to so that Studio One will then send the corresponding information to those pads when you change pad colors and things like that within Studio One. All right, so we'll go ahead and click on OK here. Let's close out of our options menu. Now we want to go ahead and get started with a song. And before we do that, just know that if you click on open, this is going to go to your song. Well, it's going to open up a Explorer or Finder on the Mac so that you can navigate to a song that you may want to open up if it's not in your recent files list for whatever reason. But we'd like to create a new song and get started with finding out how to work with the song page in Studio One. So we'll go ahead and click on New. Now we have this Templates tab, which is going to be on by default. Record and Mix is just going to be a basic setup, empty palette where we can start from scratch. We also have some other templates here. So if you wanted to master and release, this is going to create or take us to the project page, and we can see the file type down at the bottom, .project. So if you're going to do any mastering, this is what you would want to use, but that's more advanced. We have release and perform. We can see .show. This is a different file than working with creating songs. So if you're doing live performances, then this is what you would want to use. Launch loops. This is a new feature. We have a launcher within Studio One if you like working in that manner. We have record now, mix and surround, produce beats, and so on. We won't go through all of these. Now, we will take a look at this, audio interfaces. So if you're using a Presonus audio interface, then you can select it from this drop-down menu here. So we can see all of these different Presonus interfaces. Now you can find yours, and then your input and output routing will be taken care of for you when you choose these options. And then finally at the bottom we have some demos. If you have those installed, you can check out what other people have done within Studio One. Now we'll come back up to the top. Now also here we have user, so if you would like to create a template in Studio One, you will find those located here. So here for me, I've got Quanta Production 1. This is my template that I've created, and I can access that from here. We'll come back to templates, record and mix. Now over to the right, we have the name of our song, and by default, Studio One's going to put in the date, the current date, and then the name Quanta here, and that's based on the name that we've entered here. Now you can always go ahead and just click once and put in a new name if you'd like. This is going to be the location where it's going to be stored at, and again I've changed this by clicking on this ellipsis there, but by default this is going to be in Documents, Studio One, and Songs. And that's where it ties in with this. When we click on this tab, we've talked about that already. Now moving on, we have sample rate and resolution. I go with 48 and 24-bit. I think that these are good settings, but this is an advanced topic, and I would urge you to do your own research to figure out what is going to work best for your situation. But I've always used this. I feel like these are good settings. And then we have bars, the top for our time base, the length of our song. If we scroll down, we have our tempo that the song is going to be, the time signature, and key signature. And down at the very bottom, we have this stretch audio files to tempo. And this is very important. And I can't remember if this is selected by default or not. But what this means is that if we were to import audio files into our song once we've created it, and say our tempo is 140, and the audio files have embedded tempo information of 100 BPM, then Studio One is going to stretch those audio files to fit with our tempo. So if you'd prefer not to have that behavior, then you'll want to deselect this checkbox here. Just keep in mind, though, that we're not stuck with this even if we leave this check when we create our song. We do have the capability of telling our tracks, our audio files, not to follow the tempo that we have here, even after we've created our song. And we can change any of these settings that we see here after we've created our song. So don't stress too much about this, but after you have chosen your sample rate and resolution, I would just leave all of this basically the same and never touch it. Don't worry about it. And we can kind of hide those settings by clicking on this disclosure arrow there. Now, next we have this drop files here. So if you have a Finder or Explorer window and a group of files, audio files, or any media files that you'd like to bring in, you can select those, drop them here, and they'll be included in our song once we create it. Now, at the very bottom, we have Apply Customization. So This is basically, we can customize what we see for the Studio One interface. And so I've created my own template here, I guess you could call it, Quanta One. But if we click on this, we have complete, basic, minimal, and audio editing. So for this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and put this back to complete so that we're all going to have the same view, but just know that we have this available here. And we'll take a closer look at that once we get into our song. Okay, so I'm happy with all of these settings here. Let's go ahead and click on OK, and we'll be taken to the song page. Now let's just take a moment to get familiar with where everything is at. Like right in the middle here, we have our arrange view. So all of our audio and MIDI recordings are going to show up here. And then to the left, we have our track column. If we click on the eye, we have our inspector. This is going to be our track list. And we'll come back to those in just a second after we've created some things. And we'll also come back to these after we've created a few tracks and move on a bit. Now here we can access our tools, and of course we could just click once to switch between our tools. These actually tie in with the number keys at the top of our QWERTY keyboard. So 1 is going to be our arrow tool, 2 is our range tool, 3 is the split tool, 4 is the eraser, 5 the paint, and so on. And we'll come back to take a closer look at these in just a moment. Now here we have some more advanced tools. So this is going to be our audio bend for kind of warping our audio. This is going to be our strip silence, and this will be our quantized panel or more detailed view. This is our macro panel here. We have input quantize, so while we're recording MIDI, we can, if we activate this, then it's going to snap the MIDI notes that we're playing to the current quantized value. And we can change our quantized value by clicking on that downward facing arrow, and then we can put in a value that we'd like. This is our time base, which is going to be in bars, but we can also choose seconds and samples. Then we have our snap, adaptive, and some other options here that are a bit more advanced. Now this is going to be our snap function. We can turn that on and off here. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, we'll come back to that. Now here we have ripple edit. We'll come back to that. We have our auto scroll. Then we have our cursor follows edit position. We have a zoom function. This is going to show us tips whenever we're hovering over certain areas on what actions we can perform when we're doing that. But I'll go ahead and hide that. This is going to be our video player. So if we're composing to video, we can access our video player there. And then here for version 7, we now have a launcher. So we can access that by clicking there. We'll come back to that. This is going to be our scratch pad. So here we can drag MIDI parts, audio events, and experiment or store things here. And just use this as a kind of, as the name implies, a scratch pad for when we're working with our songs. Now all the way to the right, we have the same buttons that I said we'll always see. Our Presonus account we can access. Clicking here, we go back to the start page. Now this is highlighted because we've created a song. If you have multiple songs open, these pages will kind of be stacked, and you can click and you'll get a drop-down menu to choose which song you want to go back to. But we just have the single page, so we'll click once to come back to our song. Now over to the right-hand side, we have our browser. Now this can be resized if you'd like. And also new in version 7, we can click on this upward facing arrow to detach the browser, and we can resize it as well to our liking and even drag that to a second monitor if you have one. But for our purposes, this beginner tutorial, we'll go ahead and reattach that. Now what we see here ties in with the tabs at the very top here. So instruments, that ties in here. So we can click on that. We're taken to the instruments tab. We then have effects. Okay, so again, we can access just 2 different ways we can access these different areas. We now have Splice integrated into our browser as well. So if you'd like to make that active, you could just click on install, and then you'll be able to access loops from Splice and use those in your music. I probably won't be installing that, but you have the option to do that. Now we have files where we can access files on our system directory, and then we can even set up a little tab at the top here to go directly to any sample libraries that we may have on our system. So if I were to right click on vocal samples here, I can new tab from here, and then we can see now I can directly go to my vocal samples like so. If we want to remove it, then we can right click and just choose to close that tab. Now next we have the cloud, where we can access things like the Presonus Exchange, Studio One Pro, the SoundCloud, etc. The shop for getting things from the shop. Then the pool, this is going to be a central repository for everything that we record, all of the audio recordings and audio that we may bring into our song as well, like audio files from our sample library. So even if you were to add an audio track and record a vocal and you delete the vocal from the arrange view, it's still going to be here within the pool. And we may come back to that a little bit later. Now at the bottom we have our transport controls. So here we have MIDI. We can see MIDI activity from our MIDI controller. This is going to light up when you trigger keys. So this is a good area to troubleshoot if you're playing your MIDI controller and it's not triggering your virtual instruments. Just take note if this is lighting up here, and if it's not, then you know there's something wrong with your cable connection or a setting on your controller. We can see our performance here for CPU and disk activity. If we click on the performance word, then this opens up the performance monitor window. We can see the CPU and disk use. Here we have our dropout protection, which is a bit more advanced. We can click on the show devices to see what our virtual instruments and effects are doing with our CPU and find ones that may be taxing our processor there. So we'll go ahead and close that out. We have our sample rate, how much time we have left to record on our hard drive. That's going to vary depending on the size of your hard drive. Displays for seconds and bars. If you're on a smaller resolution, you may only see one of these. We have our fast forward and navigation, stop, play, record. This is activating loop. This is the start or the position of our loop region here, syncing, and some other controls. We won't go into all of this. We can activate our metronome by clicking here. So when I play back, now we hear that. If I turn it off, it's gone. Okay, now you can make some adjustments to this. You can change the sound and so on of your metronome. So if we click on this wrench icon, we're taken to the metronome setup. So if you're not happy with the default sounds, you can come to these drop-down menus and choose something different. You can even add your own sounds if you'd like. We can add an offbeat if we'd like. So if I take the level up for the offbeat and then go ahead and play back again, let's turn the metronome back on. Okay, so that's available to you as well. We have our 4/4, we can change 3/4, time signature, the key of our song if you'd like to set that. We have global transpose, which is yet another feature in version 7. So this is going to transpose plus or minus 12 semitones, everything within your song when you make use of this. Now you can come to individual tracks and tell it not to pay attention to the global transpose, but when you make this adjustment, it's going to transpose in semitones your entire song. Finally, we have the tempo. We can click once to manually put in a value. I'll put in 120 and press enter to accept that. We can also drag up or down to change. And if we repeatedly tap on tempo, then I'll tap really fast. We can take that up like so. You can also assign that to a shortcut key, and I believe I've assigned that to B on my QWERTY keyboard. So I'm going to repeatedly tap B as in boy and just take note of the tempo. Okay, so that is changing. I'll go ahead and click once to change that back to 120, press enter. Now if you'd like to add your own shortcuts, we would need to, let's shift F and exit out of full screen. I believe it's been a long time since I've gone here. So shortcuts, that's not right. That's just going to list all of the shortcuts that are available. So I believe it's under Studio One here. Let's try this one here. Okay, so now you can see this here. So if I type in the word tempo, now we can see at the bottom transport. This is our transport bar, tap tempo. That's what it is when we were clicking. And if I were to select that, then we can see that I have put in B here. This will be blank for you, and you can just come here and enter a key and then click on assign. Once you type a key in, this will be highlighted and you can click on that. If I wanted to remove the B, then I can just click on remove while it's highlighted. And so you can create your own keyboard shortcut schemes, and then you can access different ones here. If you're coming from Cubase or Logic, etc., you can actually change to those shortcut keys as well by choosing here. You can import and export and export as text. All right, let's go ahead and cancel out of here. We'll go ahead and enter back into full screen. Now, what about recording audio? We've set up our audio interface, and let's say we'd like to record a vocal. So for that, we'll need an audio track, and we have multiple ways to create that. We can right-click in the track column here, and we can choose Add Tracks. And this is going to bring up our Add Tracks dialog, where you can choose to add audio, instrument track, automation track, or folder track. Let's cancel out. I'll right-click again, and just know that you can specifically choose to create an audio track in mono or stereo or an instrument track. So you can choose those discreetly here. We can also click on the plus, and that will bring up our Add Tracks dialog. My favorite way is to press T as in Tom and bring up the dialog here. We can choose a count. I only want one. It's already labeled vocal, but you can put in a name for the track there. The format's typically going to be in mono, but you can choose from a variety of settings there. You can also choose the input that you're going to be using from your audio interface. So if you have your microphone plugged into input 1, then you can choose input L. These are kind of this is the default naming scheme for Studio One, input L, input R. You'll also probably see input L plus R for stereo, but we can change this naming scheme. But we'll go ahead and leave this on input L, and I'll just click on OK. This basically represents the left microphone built into my laptop screen. The R is going to be the right microphone because I have two mics in my laptop screen. We'll click on OK, and I'm going to press Shift and E to make this larger vertically. So Shift and E will make our tracks larger vertically. Shift and W will make them smaller. And if I don't hold Shift and I just press E, then we zoom in horizontally. Let's close out our browser for now. If I press W, then we zoom out horizontally. We can also click, hold, and drag our ruler to zoom in and out. So now we've got our audio track added, and then at this point all we need to do is click on the record arm, and then we can hear the monitoring. So we can hear this is the audio being recorded from my laptop screen. It's a little bit distracting because there's latency. So I'm going to turn that monitoring off, and we can see our signal level here. You want to be sure that you're not clipping, that you'll get a red box if you're clipping, but the most important place to pay attention to is your audio interface. Be sure you're not clipping there. Your audio interface will usually have a red LED on it, and if that turns red, then you know you're recording with clipping, and once you record with that, you can't get rid of it. I mean, there may be some ways with processing software, but it's just not clean in my opinion. It's better to get a quality signal coming in from the very beginning. That's most important to set your gain properly on your physical audio interface before you start recording in Studio One. So I usually recommend people record or sing the loudest part or play the loudest part of your song. If turn it up to once you see clipping, then back it back down to be sure you're not clipping, and then you're ready to record. But for Studio One, we just need to be sure that this is on for recording. If you want to hear your vocal in your headphones, maybe you want to add reverb, then you'll want to turn on the monitoring. But for this tutorial, I'm going to leave that off because we have that latency. So now that we've got this armed, we can see our signal coming in. And I can just come down to the transport and click on this circle here. And if you have a number pad on your QWERTY keyboard, you can click on the asterisk. You can see that little pop-up window. Clicking on the asterisk will enter into record as well. So I'll go ahead and click to enter into record. We can then see a waveform representing the vocal that's being recorded here. I'll go ahead and press the space bar to stop. We now have an audio event with our vocal. I'm going to press the comma to take our playback cursor to the very beginning here. I'll press the space bar. So I'll go ahead and click to enter into record. We can then see a waveform. Okay, so now we can hear our audio recording. Now let's go ahead and hop over to our track column here, and we can see input L, that selection that we made in the Add Tracks dialog. But I just want to make a quick note that if you'd like to change to a different input on your audio interface, then we can simply click on here, and we can access the other inputs on your audio interface. Now, if you have an interface that has, say, 8 inputs and you're only seeing 2 here, then you may need to go to the Audio I/O setup, which we can access by, again, clicking on this. Coming down to the bottom, if I go ahead and select that, then we have our Audio I/O setup here. Now here we can see the physical inputs on our audio interface. Again, this is my left microphone and the right microphone in my laptop screen. If I were using my Focusrite, then I would see some more here. If you have an interface that has 8, then you'll see those 8 physical inputs here. And you may need to click on the Add Mono and or Stereo to populate more fields here. And then you'll want to bridge those connections by placing a box to link those. Actually, it should be populated for you automatically, and it will add them sequentially and go down in a diagonal as you're adding new mono and stereo. So if you're not getting signal for your other inputs, just remember to come to the audio I/O, and then you can add those additional inputs on your audio interface here. This is for our inputs. And once you've made those connections, you can also come here and double click and rename these to be something that makes a bit more sense for you. So if this is input 1, you can call this, well, this is the stereo for 1 and 2, both mics. So this could be stereo 1 and 2. Then this one here could be input 1, that's just mono. And then let's double click here. This could be input 2. And then as you go down through 8, you can just name those input 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. You get the idea. Now, after you set that up, that's only going to apply to this one particular song. So if you want that setup to be maintained throughout any song that you create, you'll need to come down to the bottom left-hand corner here and choose Make Default. Then in that way, whenever you create a new song, those connections that you've made and the routing setups that you've made, the names that you may have put in will show up in all of your new songs. You don't need to come to this window ever again, unless you change your audio interface. Now this is for our inputs, and here we have our outputs. Generally, we'll just have 2, a stereo out. So this is okay, unless you're working in surround sound, then you'll need to set that up here. Again, you can add mono and stereo outputs at the bottom here. We'll come back to the input tab. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to cancel out of there. Now, next to this area here where we choose our inputs and access our I/O. Now, if you don't have an audio track created to access the audio I/O, you can always press Control, comma, and then here we have song setup in the bottom left, and then here is our audio. When you go to song setup, it's probably going to start up on general, but here we have meta information we can put in for the song. Then we have our audio I/O setup. Okay. Then let's go ahead and click OK here. Now, again, here we have mono. We created a mono, but we can always click on this circle and change our track to stereo if we'd like. Let's take that off. For our audio tracks, we have this little icon that kind of represents a waveform, an audio waveform. This is a waveform, and that's basically what that is to help you identify what is audio tracks versus instrument tracks versus folder tracks and so on. Now, let's take a look at this audio event. That's what this is called when we record audio. Now, there's a lot of things that we can do with this. It's really very cool, the options that we have with working with audio in Studio One and any DAW, modern DAW these days. So, now, one of the first things, if you don't like the color, we can click on the color bar here, and we can change this to be something different. If we'd like, your colors are going to be a little bit different than mine. If I click on this downward facing arrow, then you can choose presets here. So this would be the default. I created my own color palette, and that's what I'm using here. But just know that you can access different presets by clicking on that downward facing arrow. Okay, I'll just change that there. We won't be too picky. All right, so one of the first things is that notice here and in the corners here, when I move away, those dots, those handles go away. So, but when I hover, those come back. This is a little bit different than previous versions. This is new to 7, that these will show and hide based on if you're hovering. If I come to the top right corner, I can introduce a fade here at the end. And then if I come to the handle here and click, hold, and drag down, I can create an exponential fade out. If I come to the top, then we have a logarithmic fade out. And then we can take that back to the linear like so. I'll go ahead and take that back out. In the center, we can adjust the gain for this. By default, this is going to be on 0. So once I click and hold, we can see that that's 0 dB. As I click, hold, and drag this down, we can see that's now down to -8 dB. And we can see the difference there in parentheses of how much we've reduced it. minus 8 dB. That makes sense, right? Okay, we can also increase the gain. So as I take this up, and we see the waveform getting larger, but just keep in mind, when we make these adjustments, it is increasing the overall level of your audio recording. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. Now, if we'd like to take this back to the default of 0 dB at any time, then we can hold Control and hover on that handle and click, and then now we are back to 0 dB. Now, as you can imagine, on the front left top corner, we have a handle where we can introduce a fade in, and we can also use the handle as we saw with the fade out. We'll go ahead and take that back out. Now we can trim our audio event by hovering at either end, and as we do so, we have these double arrows, so I can click, hold, and drag to the left. We don't have anything out to the right because that's where we stop recording. If we did, we can adjust that like this. Then we can come here and pull this in like so. So anything that we'd like to remove, we can do this like that, like so. Now, just very important to keep in mind is that this is non-destructive editing. So this is not altering our original file. I like to tell people to think of this as kind of like a window. And these are like window shades on the left and right-hand side. So whatever we want to see or hear in this instance of working with a DAW, then we will adjust the shades, and this is our window to the original audio file. The original audio file, if we come down to the bottom right corner to our browse and click on the pull, this is our original audio file here. So as I adjust this, that's not changing or altering the length of our original recording. I could even delete this out of our arrange view just by selecting and pressing delete, but our original still remains here, and I can click, hold, and drag that in from the pull, and we're back to as we were. So if you ever accidentally delete an audio file from your song, don't worry. You can use Control-Z to undo that action, but if it happened a while ago, you can always come to your pull and find it within there. All right, now moving on, we have a bunch of cool options that we can access by right-clicking our audio events. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click, and we can see the name of our event here, but I could just change this, and we can name our events, which is going to be different than the track name that we have here. So this initially took on the name of our track. And but once I right click and then double click here, we can put in a different name. So if we have multiple audio events on this track, we can name them discreetly. We can see our file tempo, and we can double click on this to put in a new tempo for this audio event. We can speed up or slow down. So let's go ahead and play this back. We can then see a waveform. Now, if I were to right click again, double click, and I'll just put in 0.5, press enter. Now this is going to play back at half speed. Let's go ahead. We can then see a waveform representing. Okay, let's go ahead and right click again. I'll double click. We'll put in 1, so that's going to be no change. That takes it back to as it was. We can transpose our event. I'll click and let's put in 3. This is going to be in semitones, so this is going to be increased by 3 semitones.
Form representing the vocal.
Okay, let's right click again. Change that back to the default. We have tuning. This is going to be in sense. Now we have some bend marker controls. These are a bit beyond the scope. We have a gain envelope. Once we introduce that, then we can add points and adjust the gain for individual events like so. This is snapping to our quantized value, quarter notes. If I turn snapping off, then we can move these around freely like so. So we can do some really fine adjustments to the gain. If we have one part that's really aggressive, then we can add points and move that part down like so. If I come to the top, we have a trim tool, and I can push this down or pull that level up like so. But let's go ahead and remove those points by using undo, and we'll right click and turn that gain envelope off. This is going to bypass the gain envelope by clicking it there. We have time lock and edit lock. Time lock is going to prevent this audio event from being moved. Edit lock will prevent any edits from happening to that event. So if you kind of want to protect it, then you can make use of these. We then have loop. If I click on this, it's going to loop this. While it's highlighted, I'll press Shift and S as in Sam. This loops it to the end of our song. Okay, let's undo that. And we'll zoom back in on this. And right click. We can add effects just to this event alone. So we can add tracks to the entire track, which will affect every event on the track. But if we'd like to add an effect to just one event, then we can do that by coming here. A bit beyond the scope of this tutorial, but just know that that's available. Traditional cut, copy, delete, we can duplicate that. We can also press D. So while this is selected, if I press D as in dog, then we duplicate that like so. Let's undo. Now a new feature in version 7 is that we can hover at the bottom right-hand corner here, and we see we have this arrow with that circular arrow to the right. And we already saw we can come with these double arrows and trim like so. But if we specifically come down to the bottom right-hand corner, we can click, hold, and drag that out, and then that's going to be looped like so. Not really useful for something like a narration, but if you've got like a drum loop or something like that, this could be useful for you. Let's turn our snap back on, come back, and take that back to the default. Now let's right-click again. We can detect the tempo, which of course would be most useful for rhythmic material or drum loops, things like that. Merge events, a bit beyond the scope of this. We can extract the tempo information to our tempo track. And then these are recent items. So actions that we've been performing most recently are going to show up here. So this is going to update dynamically. So if what you see here looks different than mine, that's just because these are some of the processing things that I've been using recently. Now, if we come down to event, we have a bunch of different actions that we can apply to this event. So we can mute that event. We can see that there has been muted. Let's come back and we can, let's activate the mute tool here and unmute that. Come back there. Okay, now our events. So this is a lot to go through, but just quickly know we can bounce the new track. A lot of different features to explore here. Now, next in line, we have audio. And then here, we're going to have some cool options available. So we can normalize. This is going to take the highest peaks up to 0 dB. You can see what happened there. I'll go ahead and undo that. Let's right click again. We'll come back to audio. We can reverse our audio. And then here you can see the shortcuts for all of these actions here. Separate stems, strip silence. We can edit with Melodyne, remove Melodyne, a ton of different options. Here in our audio bin, we can detect the tempo for our audio event, detect transients, extract a tempo track, which we've already seen before. We can detect chords, remove chords. So just a whole ton of goodness can be found here. We can even send this to Sample One, which is the virtual instrument sampler within Studio One, or we can send it to Impact, which is the drum machine in Impact. Now, I had mentioned at the beginning of this video that we would come back to the inspector, and I think now is a good time to do so because I would like to show, particularly down here at the bottom, if we hover here and then let's click, hold, and drag this up. When I select this event, a lot of the different features that we saw when we right-click, for instance, like the file tempo and the transpose and tuning, if we have our inspector open, we can select that event and perform those actions here. So we have our tempo here. If I click on the downward facing arrow, we can do double tempo, half tempo, or we can clear the tempo from this event. This is the speed up where we can put in 0.5 and have it play back at half speed. We can transpose in semitone or tune it in sense. We have our gain, which before we use the gain handle, but we can manually input a value here. So -8 if we want to take it down, or +5 if we want to increase the gain. We have our fade in. So if I click, hold, and drag, we can see that that fade is being introduced here. Whereas before we grab that handle and manually put that in. If I hold Control and click on this field here, that will take it back to 0 seconds. This is our fade out. We can view bend markers. This changes the view to see bend markers if we've added those. A more advanced topic. This is our gain envelope, which we've seen in our bypass for the gain envelope. This is the loop. Again, that will extend out to the end of our song. And then we have our time lock and edit lock, which will protect our event from moving it with the time lock or performing accidental edits if we have the edit lock selected. So we'll go ahead and pull this back down. Here we have a meter and fader for controlling the level of our track. We can add inserts here. So if we click on the plus, I'll type in reverb. So now we add a room reverb to this track. Into record, we can then see a waveform. So this reverb is going to apply to the entire track, not just this one event, but anything that's on this track. We can close this window out by clicking here. If we'd like to access it again, we can double click on the word room reverb. Now we have a micro view for the room reverb and any other effects that we may be using. So if I single click just one time, then we can access some of the more important controls here for our room reverb. And if you're using a third-party processor, you can actually choose which parameters are going to show up within here. With the Studio One native effects, then you can't really make that changes to what shows up here, but with third-party, you can. Single clicking, we then take that out. If we'd like to remove the effect, then we can click on this downward-facing arrow, and then at the bottom, we have remove. This here is our sends, so we can create sends here by clicking on the plus, and then we can add a bus channel or an effects channel and put various processing like reverb and delays on the effects channel and send this channel audio to our effects channel. We then have mute and solo, which ties in with mute and solo here. We have our record arm and monitoring controls. We can choose our inputs and outputs here. We only have main set up, so that's all that's available. But if we had a bus, then we could select that from there. We have panning that's available. And then let's hover here and pull this down a little bit here. Now in this top panel, we talked about at the beginning of this video when we were creating the song, there was the checkbox for stretch audio files to song tempo. And I said that don't stress out about it too much because you can always change this even after you've created your song. And this is where that happens. So if this is an audio file that I actually imported into Studio One and it had a BPM embedded in it of say 80 beats per minute and it got stretched to 120 and you don't want that, but maybe everything else in your song you do, you can come here, access the inspector by clicking on the eye, and then here at the top we have time stretch. So if you deselect when you're creating your song to have Studio One time stretch your songs, this is not going to be on time stretch. If you do have that box checked, it will be. But we can click on this and choose don't follow, and then your audio event is not going to follow the tempo that you select here. Okay? So just be aware that you can access that there. And when this is in time stretch mode, by default, the algorithm is going to be set for drums. But if you have a vocal melody, then this is not really going to be the best algorithm to choose for time stretching a vocal drums. So we can click on this, and then we can access sound, Elastic Pro format. So this would be more for polyphonic material. This solo would be for melodies, recordings that are playing one note at a time in a melody. And then we have tape resampler. So this is going to function like a traditional sampler. So as you, if the audio is being stretched up, then it's going to play back faster and it's going to pitch up. And then alternatively, if you're stretching, let's just do it. So we'll choose tape resampler. We can come to the bottom right-hand corner. Now, if I hold Alt, we've seen that this will create the loop. But if I hold Alt, then take note here, we have that little clock that appears. Now, if I stretch this out and play back, okay, so it's going to be more like a traditional sampler. I'll hold Alt again. We have the clock. Let me pull this in. Now we're going to have the chipmunk effect.
You can then see a waveform representing the vocal that's being recorded.
Okay, let's undo. And so just be aware that you have several different modes for the time stretch when you're using that. But I'll go ahead and set that back to the default of drums. Here we can work with our groups and layers here, a bit beyond the scope. Everything here is a bit beyond the scope of this tutorial. But just know that you can play overlaps, follow chords for the chord track, follow global transpose. We did mention this when we were taking a look at the transport. So if you change this to +3 semitones or -semitones, but you don't want this track to follow the changes that you make in the global transpose, then you would just want to be sure that this box is deselected. Okay, for now, we'll go ahead and close out our inspector. And again, we'll quickly take a look at the track list. So we have one track in here, and we can see that now. If I click on that, we can expand out and see our automation envelopes for this track. And so this track list is really going to be useful for if you have, say, 40, 50, 100 or more tracks within your song, then this is going to give you a broad overview of those tracks, and you can kind of manage the visibility of what's going on with those tracks. Just much easier than scrolling around and zooming in and out when you have a large track count within your song. So we will close that back out. Now, what about MIDI and recording MIDI and using virtual instruments? So as many of you know, Studio One is really heavy on drag and drop. So what we can do is come to the browser. Let's switch over to our instruments. And then here we have our Presonus, all of the native instruments that are available with Presonus. And then here I have some other third-party VST instruments. I like to keep things simple, so I don't really have too many installed on my system. I prefer to master a handful of instruments instead of having 100 that I only know a little bit about. But we can expand this out. Basically, this is everything that comes with Studio One. Now, I have hidden at least one instrument that I never use, and that would be the Mojito. So if I click on this wrench icon, this is going to allow us to manage what we can see within our instrument and effects within the browser. So here's the Mojito. And if I click on that circle and exit out of this setup mode, now we can see our Mojito here. But if we right click, then we can hide that. So anything that we don't want to see, we can hide. But let's bring in a My Tai, and then just simply click, hold, and dragging that in, and that automatically creates an instrument track for us. An instrument track is basically just the same thing as a MIDI track. It will record the incoming MIDI information from your MIDI controller, your external keyboard that you've connected to your computer. Now, up at the top here, we can choose the different sounds or patches that we would like to use. So let's come to the pad folder, click on that disclosure arrow, and we'll go ahead and select this dark pad here. I'm going to press caps lock, and this will bring up our virtual QWERTY keyboard controller, which will allow us to use our computer keyboard. You can see this matches up with the top row of keys, letters on your computer keyboard. So now when I press those, you'll see this lights up. But if you have an external controller connected, you don't need this. You can just play your external keyboard and trigger this device. And all we need to do, let's go ahead and take our audio track out of record, because if this is armed for recording, when we enter into record here, then we're going to record over our audio that we previously did. We don't want to do that. At least I don't. So we've got this armed for recording. Another important point about this is if you are playing with your external controller and you're not hearing anything, so if I take that off and I'm triggering, you can see these lighting up, but we're not hearing anything. So if I turn on monitoring, now we can. So just be aware that if you are not hearing anything, you may need to turn this on. And we'll go ahead and arm this for recording, and we'll enter into record. So I'll go ahead and click to enter into record. We can then see a waveform representing the vocal that's being recorded here. And if you notice here the space bar, that these in version 7, the view of our MIDI notes has changed. These are a lot fatter now. I didn't particularly care for it before, but they do get smaller as I play down in lower registers. These return more to that normal view. The more MIDI notes that we have going on that we record in here, then these are going to get smaller. So I guess I think for me, I just prefer the smaller view for the MIDI notes, but what are you going to do? So let's caps lock to get rid of that, and we've got our MIDI recorded, so we can come here and play back. Let's access our virtual instrument by clicking on this keyboard icon, and we can view that again. Okay, now a few things to keep in mind with our MIDI and controlling or recording MIDI to our virtual instruments, if I can get that out right. In our track column here, specifically the track header for our instrument track, here we can see the Mai Tai that we've added. If you have multiple instruments within the song, you can click on this and you can choose to have these MIDI notes to play any virtual instrument that's within your song. So you can make that selection by clicking on this top drop-down menu. Now the second selection area, if we click on that, if you have multiple keyboards that you've added, then you can, if you have say 2 or 3 MIDI keyboards, you can select which one you want to specifically use to trigger the virtual instrument. If you leave this on the default of all inputs, then any MIDI keyboard that you play will trigger this device. I think this is the safest option, to just leave it on the default. So here's that MPK MIDI that we added at the beginning of the tutorial. And actually, I don't want that in here. I don't have an MPK MIDI. So let's come to configure. I'll select the MPK MIDI. We'll click on remove to take that out of there. Okay, so now that doesn't show up as an option anymore. So this is just for groups and layers, a bit beyond the scope of this tutorial. But this is just important to be aware of, that you're choosing your input source or your output to the virtual instrument here and the input from your external controller. Really, I would not worry about changing these unless you're doing something very specific. Now, as we saw with our audio, we can click on this color bar here to change the color of our track and all of the MIDI parts that are on it. This is specifically called a MIDI part. This is specifically a MIDI event. Now, we took a look at a lot of the different features that are available for working with our audio events. Now, let's do the same with our MIDI part. When I right-click here, we have some different options available to us here. We do have the similar transpose, so we can transpose this in semitones by clicking there. Then we can adjust the velocity in percentage. We have time lock and edit lock for kind of protecting our MIDI part. We have the loop, which will take it to the end of our song. If we have another event on this track, it will take that loop to the next event on our track. We can add a sync point, the familiar cut, copy, paste, duplicate, which we've already saw by pressing D. We can take those out. Let's undo and right click again. So we can mute, merge, and so on. We have similar event controls. We have a different section, whereas with our audio event, we have audio. Now for our MIDI part, we have instrument. You could also call it an instrument part. So we can extract a chord track, insert instrument parts from chord track, detect key signature, explode pitches to tracks. So this is going to put these different pitches on different tracks within our arrange view. So just a lot of cool things that we can do. We have some musical functions, transposing, applying the scale, freeze pitch, delete notes. So just a ton of different options that are definitely beyond the scope of this introductory tutorial. Now, what if we would like to edit these individual notes? Maybe we made a couple of errors, but we're happy with 95% of it, but we just want to fix a couple of notes. Well, while it's selected by clicking once, we can come to Edit and open up our Edit window. But let's go ahead and close that out. We can also just simply double-click on our MIDI part, and that will open up our Edit window. If I hover at the top, we can increase the vertical size of this. So here we can view all of our notes. We can click, hold, and drag in our ruler to zoom in and out. And as we saw in the arrange view, if I press E as in Eddie, we can zoom in horizontally. If I press W, we zoom out. If I hold Shift and W, we zoom out vertically. Shift and E, we zoom in vertically. Okay, so now we can see all of our notes, and I can also hold Control and use the mouse wheel to zoom in vertically here. And take note of these individual notes. So when we're zoomed out vertically, we don't see the pitch names on these notes. But if I zoom in again vertically, now we see that these pop up so we can easily identify what pitches these are. Now we can just simply click once to select, and I can right arrow to then move sequentially through these notes, and then I can use the up and down arrow to change the pitch. If I hold Alt and left and right arrow, then we're going to nudge this, and then I believe Alt and Shift, we nudge this. Maybe it's Alt and Control. Okay, that's going to be by bar. And there's another way we can nudge this by ticks, but holding Alt, we can nudge that like so. We can select a group of notes and then use the up and down arrows to move multiple notes at a time up and down. Now hovering at the edge, our arrow changes to double arrows, and we can change the length of our note if we'd like to extend these. And of course we can select the group, the entire group, and extend these out. Now something to keep in mind is that some of these actions are going to be affected by whether we have snap turned on or off. So right now this is turned on, it's set to 16th notes. But I'm going to change this to quarter notes. And then we can see that when I hover here, this is now snapping to our quarter note subdivision. So if you'd like to be very precise and snap this to a particular subdivision, just be sure your snap is engaged and you set the quantized value here. If you'd prefer to have more control, then just be sure your snap is turned off, and then you can freely place it wherever you'd like. If we'd like to add additional notes, then we can double click if we have the arrow tool active, and we can click, hold, and drag to extend that out. If we're using the paint tool here, which we can activate by clicking once or pressing 3 on the QWERTY keyboard, I just click and hold, left click and hold, and we can add and extend out to the length we would like for that note to be. I'll press 1 to come back to the arrow tool. And I want to mention here, in a previous version, we had this arrow, downward facing arrow added, and if I click and hold on that, we can choose extended or basic. So when extended is highlighted, let's zoom in a little bit more. I'll hold Control and zoom in a bit. Our arrow is going to change to perform different actions depending on where we hover at these MIDI notes. So at the top, we see that changes to a little pencil. And take note of the velocity down here. When this is active, if I click, hold, and drag, if you notice the velocity bar in our parameter automation lane here, let's extend this up a little bit. And I'm going to take a quick look at this. I'm going to show the velocity bar. You see these are all one solid color. I'm going to add the velocity bar. And now we can see the velocity on each of these individual notes. So I'll again come to the top and hover. We now have that. And you can see I'm adjusting the velocity for this like so. If I come to this one, hover at the top, I can adjust its velocity. I can click, hold, and drag to select all of them, and we can adjust the velocity for all of these in one go. Now if I come to the bottom, we have the split tool that becomes active, and I can make a cut anywhere I'd like. If we have two notes that we'd like to join together, we will come to, they have to be right next to each other, but we'll come to that split. Now we have a little glue bottle, and if I click on that, then we join these back together. Sometimes it can be a little bit funky, but there we go, the glue tube. I'll click once, and now we merge those back. Now if you notice, when I click or double click to add, we're hearing that playback. If you'd prefer not to hear that behavior, then we can deselect audition notes, and we don't hear anything now when we're adding or selecting our notes. And let's backtrack a bit, because I want to mention that if you don't want that extended behavior where the tool switches when you're hovering, then you can come to the downward facing arrow, change this to basic, and your arrow tool will not change at all when you're hovering on your notes. Now we can also come down to the parameter automation lane and click or hover over a velocity bar, and that's going to adjust the velocity of our notes as well. If you take notice here, this is actually adjusting the velocity for all three of these notes. If you only want to adjust one, but they're kind of stacked on top of each other like this, just click once to select it. You see that this is now highlighted in white, and I can then discreetly adjust this one note like so. Now, if we'd like to see a larger view for our edit window, we can click on this upward facing arrow. You can drag this to another monitor and then click on this button to maximize. So you have this really awesome large view of the edit window. We can click on the downward facing arrow to return that back to as it was. We have a scale feature over here on the left hand panel here. So by default, this is going to be on C chromatic. And when I check this, if you notice the keys here now have these little blue borders, letting us know the scale that our notes are going to lock to, which is every key because we're in C chromatic. If I were to change this to say E and let's say minor triad, then we can see that only a few of these notes, the ones that are within the scale that we chose, are going to be lit here. And so we can then come to the action menu and apply scale and just take note of our MIDI parts when I hit apply. Those are then going to be moved to the nearest pitch that is within the scale that we've selected here. But we'll go ahead and undo that and take off the scale feature. In the top left corner, we can switch to a drum view if we're working with a virtual drum machine. And then here we have a score view. So if we'd like to do some scoring, we have access to that there. And let's go ahead and close out our edit window. Now let's take a quick look at some of the tools that we have available to us at the top. I said that we would come back to this section after we added a few tracks. We've got an audio event and a MIDI part and something to work with here. Now, by default, this bracket is going to be highlighted if you're just getting started with the application and you haven't made any changes. Now, when this is active, just notice that our arrow and the range tool are both highlighted in blue. If I deselect that bracket, we only have the arrow. Now, what happens with this is that, let's hover at the border here and make our audio track a bit larger. Now, when I'm in the top half of this audio event, we have the crosshairs here that show up. And just keep in mind that our tools, most of the tools that we use are going to be affected by our snap. So our snap is turned on. You can see that that vertical bar is snapping to quarter notes because our quantized value is set to quarter note. Now, in the top half, we have the crosshair. And then when I cross that center line, we have the arrow tool. So this is supposed to help you with particular editing actions, like if you want to remove certain areas of this audio event, we can come to the top with the crosshairs. This is going to be when the range tool is active, which is here. So I can then, if I wanted to remove this section, I can click, hold, and drag with the range tool, and then I can press delete on the keyboard. But I'll go ahead and undo that, and let's select this range here. Maybe I'd like to move this to a different area of the song. In the top with the crosshairs, we select a range. I come down to the bottom, we have the arrow tool. Then I can click, hold, and drag this to a different area. We'll again undo. And while this is highlighted with that range selection, I can Control C to copy, place the cursor here at bar 8, and then Control V to paste that range as well. But if you'd prefer for your mouse not to change wherever you're hovering, and this is how I prefer not for it to change on me like that, you can just deselect that, and now you'll always have the range tool wherever you hover. Now, next we have the split tool. So we can access that. As we mentioned, this ties in with the number keys at the top of your keyboard. So I'll press 3, and then now you can see this is snapping to our quarter notes. And then here, I'm going to make cuts at quarter note subdivisions. If you'd like to more freely make cuts, press in or click on this button here to turn your snap off. Now you can see this smoothly moves along, and I can make a cut even in between that quarter note subdivision. All right, we'll go ahead and undo those cuts. And then next we have the erase tool. I'll press 4, or we can click there. That's just going to erase any event that we hover and click once on. We then have the paint tool. We can create empty audio events. Let's double click on our MIDI part. This is more useful for the working with MIDI. As we saw, we can click once and then drag to create the length of MIDI note that we would like when we're using the paint tool in the edit window. Let's go ahead and select that empty event and delete that out. We then have the mute tool, and we've already seen this. This is going to mute whatever we select. And we can just click again to toggle that on and off. We then have the bend tool, and this is going to add bend markers. This is moving smoothly, again, because our snap is turned off, but if I press N or click here to turn our snap on, you see, let's deselect that. You can see that that's snapping to our quarter note subdivision. Okay, now if I click here, let's click here, and we'll click here and here. And it looks like nothing is happening. But let me press 1 to come back to our arrow tool, and I'm going to right-click on this, and then we'll check the box for bend marker. Now we can see those bend markers that we've added. Okay, and if I hover, first we need to make sure that the bend tool is active. I'll press 7. And now when I hover on one of these bend markers, we need to change that so we see that quarter note icon. Then I can click hold, and then I can stretch and compress this particular area. So when it turns red, the deeper red, that means that it's being stretched more. When it's green, it's being compressed. Okay. So again, this is a bit beyond the scope of this video, but I just wanted to at least show that this is available as a feature and what that bend tool is. We'll go ahead and remove those by undoing, and we'll right click and take it out of the bend marker view. Then next we have the listen tool. So if we activate that, wherever we click, it's going to solo that track and begin playback. So if I'm on the vocal track and I come to bar 4 and click, we begin playback on bar 4 and solo our vocal track. If I want to hear playback from bar 8 on our My Tai track, our synth, I'll click here. This track is soloed and we begin playback at bar 8. Now let's press 1 to come back to our arrow tool, and then we have some more advanced tools here. So this will be our audio bend panel. That's a bit too much for a beginner. Strip silence. So this is going to basically get rid of quiet areas within our audio recordings. A bit beyond the scope of this tutorial, but we'll just take a quick look. If I select this audio event, you see this audio recording, there may be some room noise in these areas here, and we would want to remove them. Now, if I were to use the split tool and make some cuts and then delete that out, that's one way, but that would take forever. So the strip silence is supposed to automate that process. So while this event is selected by clicking once, there's some settings here that you can make to adjust the threshold of how this works. I'll hit apply, and now we can see that most of those quiet areas have been removed for us in less than a second. Okay, we'll undo that, and we'll close that out. We then have a more advanced quantize panel. Basically, it just gives you more features for working with the quantize settings of your song, but this ties in with the smaller panel here. So right now we're on quarter note, and we can see that here. If I were to click on this, that's 8th note, we see that our quantize value changes here. Alternatively, if I change the 16th note, then we can see that we change here. We have a groove option and some other cool features here. But we then have our macro panel. So these are multiple actions that we can perform in one go by clicking on these different buttons. We can come down here and choose which are available for a particular task, whether it's audio editing, music editing, music creation. You can see you have different options that become available to you based on what you select in this area here. Now, I want to hop back to this tool section really quickly because I want to talk about this blue line here. When I made that cut a second ago, I held Control, and if you notice we have the arrow, and if I hold Control, we switch to the split tool, and I can make some splits. As soon as I release Control, we change back to the arrow, and I can select these. And that's because this blue underline is here. So this is our alternate tool. Under anything that this blue line is under is going to be our alternate tool. And we can change this by clicking on the downward facing arrow. We see that the split tool is highlighted. But if I were to select the eraser tool, we see that that blue line then selects the eraser tool. And when I hold Control, we switch to the eraser tool. Now we can also change what this is under by pressing 1 repeatedly. I'll press 1 again, and one again, and one again. So now this is under the listen tool. So as you can imagine, when I hold control, we switch to the listen tool for as long as I'm holding control down. We can then see a... Okay, now once I release control, we switch back to our arrow tool. Now I'll repeatedly press 1 to take this back to the split tool, which is the tool that I like to have accessible, that I use most often and want to access when I hold control down. Now let's go ahead and move on to the mix console and slowly begin to wrap things up here. We've been going for quite a while. So we can access the mix console by clicking on this button here or pressing F3 on your QWERTY keyboard. And we can see we have 2 channels here, basically representing our 2 tracks that we see in our arrange view. I'm going to click once to be sure our arrange view is active, and I'm going to Shift W so we can see both of these along with our mix console. And I'm going to hover at the top and expand this out. So we'll quickly go over some of the features of the mix console. In the top left corner here, we have I/O, and we can access our input-output matrix, which we've talked about earlier in this video. Clicking on the wrench, we have a ton of different options for grouping, how our channels are going to be grouped. So if we want to keep our effects channels all the way to the right, or have them grouped next to the channels that they're applied to, then we can check our deselect here. We have some visibility options here, so we can colorize our channel strips like so. We can colorize our plugin header. We have input controls, so if I select this, then we can access gain and polarity controls for our channels. We'll go ahead and deselect that. We have sends and QMix, input-output connections, so we can see at the very top here, this is our input from our audio interface, and we can change that at any time within our mix console. This is our output. It's going to the main. So if we don't want to see those input-output, we can deselect, and we can see that those are now removed. We can show VCA connections, group assignments, and we have channel notes. So now we can put in notes here within our channel like so. We'll go ahead and hide that. We have channel icons. If we show that, then we can choose icons for our channels. And then we can enable a listen bus, which we can see populated here. And we can solo through listen bus. So a ton of different options that are available for setting up your mix console. And something that I forgot to mention is that we have a lot of these options available in the arrange view for our tracks as well. That's the inspector. So this wrench icon provides a ton of different options that you may want to explore as well. So like colorizing our track controls, show channel numbers in tracks, show event names, a ton of different things that you may want to look at to make Studio One perform as you would like it to. So like the locate when clicked in empty space. Now that's going to make your cursor jump to empty spaces that you click on. We'll come back here and take that back off and come back to our console here. This is fade or flip, a bit beyond this tutorial. These are going to be very useful for determining what you see in your console and how it looks, which is very important. So at the very top, we can switch between a small and large view. So if you take note, in the large view, we have our inserts and sends at the very top, and we can click on the plus. Say, come to the Presonus, we can add an amplifier there. And add effects, we can add our sends here, add an effects channel. And now this is being sent to our effects channel. But if you take notice, when we switch to the small view, that goes away. Well, how can we access those? When we switch to the small view, we then have these buttons that appear on each of these, and then we have a panel, a side panel that opens, and then we can access our sends and our inserts in this side panel here. So for each of these, okay, and we can add effects from there like so. So if you prefer to have that view, this can be a little bit more tidy and give you more real estate if you just want to mainly work with your levels and things like that. Okay, we'll switch that back to the large view. We then have a narrow and normal view. We then can show our inputs. These represent the physical inputs on our audio interface. We can show outputs if we have multiple outputs besides the stereo pair on our audio interface that we've set up, then those would show up here when we show the outputs. Okay, we'll go ahead and deselect that. We then have the external devices. So any external MIDI keyboards that we have connected and that we've set up, then we can show those here and make some adjustments to those within this panel. We then have our instrument rack. So this is going to show any virtual instruments that we have added to our song. And if I double click on the MIDI, we can access it there. And if I click on the downward facing arrow, we have some other options like being able to disable or remove that instrument. And then finally here, or not finally, but at the bottom we have show scenes. So we can create and save different scenes for our console. We then have groups, so we can view any groups that we have added with this panel there. And then we have our channel list. So that's going to be here. So when I click, that goes away, this panel. And again, this is similar to the track list, where I mentioned that if you have a ton of tracks, this will help you give you a broad overview of all of the tracks in your song. If you have 50, 80, 100 or more tracks, and you can manage the visibility and different things for the tracks. This is the same thing, but just for the console. So if you have a song with many different tracks and channels, you can manage the visibility of your channels within the channel list here. So we have these little white dots, and if I click, hold, and drag, then that's going to get rid of the channels. Okay, so I can click, hold, and drag to bring those back. Clicking once, we can toggle the visibility of those on and off. Now, here we can show and hide by track type. So this is going to show and hide our audio tracks. This will show and hide our instrument tracks. This will show and hide our effects tracks. And then this one will show and hide our buses. This is going to be for our VCAs, our aux channels. And we can also click on the filter. So if I click once and type in my, let me spell that right, for my tie, then that's just going to bring up the result of any track that has MAI in it. If you wanted to quickly find your drum tracks or your drum bus and you labeled it as such, then you could just type that in there, and then everything else will go away and you'll see whatever you type in to the search field. We have a little ellipsis here for some quick access controls to show all channels, show soloed, show muted, and so on. Just another handy option available to you there. Now, if you'd like to add additional channel types, then you can click on this downward facing arrow here. And so you can add a bus channel if you'd like, and we can see that that's now populated here. Any of our channels, we can double click and we can input a name. If we click once, then we can access the color palette and change the color. And then as we saw by clicking on the wrench, we can colorize the channel strips. And besides clicking on this downward facing arrow, we can also right click in an empty area and we can add bus, effects, VCA, or aux channel here. If I were to select our vocal track and the MIDI, I can right click and add a bus for those selected channels. So now we can see that both of these are now being routed to our bus 1. And then if you see two dashes here representing how many channels are being sent here, if I click once on that, we can see vocal and MIDI that are being sent there. Again, if I right click, we can also enable our listen bus. Solo through listen bus, we can access our audio I/O setup. While our bus is selected, well, let's just right click on this. We can remove that bus out if we'd like. We can do that for any of these channels. We have solo and mute controls, then panning. We can control click to take any of these back to their default, as we've already seen within the video. We have automation control here, maybe a bit beyond the scope of this tutorial. If we click on this button here, we can access the channel editor, and this is going to give us a display of all of the different things that are going on with this particular channel. We have our fader, mute and solo, record arm, monitoring, the input, output, panning, our channel notes, our channel icon, We can view our inserts, our sends, QMix, and then here in the top left corner, we can switch to macro controls to control different parameters. We can make those assignments by clicking on the wrench icon, okay? Then we can click on this to access routing. So a bunch of cool things that we can do within the channel editor. And I think we'll wrap up there as far as the mix console is concerned. I just wanted to basically show you where everything is located, how you can add channels, how you can remove them, and how the routing works, etc. We've already seen adding effects by clicking on the plus there. If you'd like to remove, click on the down arrow, then you can remove. You can power on your effects by clicking on their corresponding power button. Now I'm going to click on the plus and let's add a bit crusher. So now we have multiple effects on this channel, and if we'd like to power off multiple effects, then we would click on the power button at the top, like so. Now, if you'd like to power off all effects for every single channel, including the master channel, then we would use this power button here. Now you see everything is powered off at once. If we, say, have multiple channels soloed, we can turn all of those off in one go by using the global solo. If we have multiple channels muted, then of course we can click to toggle that on and off, but instead of doing it one at a time, we can come to the global mute and take care of that there. All right, so we'll go ahead and close out the mix console. Now the final and one of the most important things that we'll finish up with is how we can go about exporting our song when we've finished it. So here I have a finished song I'd like to export to a WAV file or an MP3 to share with others. So the very first step that you'll want to do is set your loop region to cover the area of your song. So here we have a tiny little triangle that you can barely see, but if I come and click, hold, and drag from there, I'm just going to set that boundary to be sure that it encompasses my full song. Be sure to keep in mind that if you have any reverb on your song, you'll want to be sure that this extends until the end of that reverb and perhaps a second or two beyond that. And then here we can hover. When we have the double arrows that pop up, we can then adjust this left-hand side. And I typically like to have a second or two before the song begins playing. So we've got our loop region set. I can then press Control and E as in excellent. And we then have our export mixdown dialog. Now this top field is going to determine where that file is going to be exported to. I'm going to choose my desktop and then select that folder. We can then give it a name, and I'll just call this tutorial. And then below that, we can choose what type of files we would like to export, and we can export multiple file types at a time. So I typically will do a WAV file and an MP3. If I click on the title for WAV file, then I can set the resolution as well as the sample rate here. Now, if I come down to MP3 and click on that, I can then choose the sample rate and the bit rate here as well. So if we'd like to export any other formats, then we can just put a check mark. And again, selecting its name, we can make adjustments to these different file types as well. But I'm going to go ahead and unselect these. And by default, this will be on between loop, and that's why it's important to set your loop region properly to encompass your song. But you also have some other options here that you can explore, and there's some other options below, such as writing the tempo of your song to the audio track, bypassing your master effects, using real-time processing if you are using any hardware processors, and so on. So here we would just click on OK, and then that will be exported. But I'm going to go ahead and cancel out because I also would just like to show that if you would like to export stems, you can press Control, Shift, and E, and then this will bring up the Export Stems dialog. Now, by default, this will be on channels, so we're exporting stems based on our channels. If you'd like to export stems based on your tracks, then you can select this here and make the corresponding selections for whatever you'd like, and then also, again, pay attention to the settings here. For what you would like, you've got your format, your location where they'll be exported to, and the file name prefix, and additional options below. And so guys, we've covered a tremendous amount of information here, and I think I could still go on, but I'm going to go ahead and control myself and just stop here. I'll go ahead and leave an index for everything that we've covered, so in that way you can easily get to the different topics, the ones that you're most interested in or would like to view again. So you can check that out in the pinned comment below. And again, if you would like to speed up your learning curve and do one-on-one trainings with me on Zoom, definitely check out the pinned comment or the description of this video. And again, we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Thanks for watching the video, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.